Okay, so imagine trying to build a nation of 10 million people practically overnight.
Right, which is already basically impossible.
Yeah, and you are starting one of the harshest desert environments on the planet. I mean, you have to construct meganacities, lay thousands of miles of electrical grid, invent a universal healthcare system, and, well, import a workforce massive enough to build it all before the concrete even has time to dry.
It is a story of explosive, almost incomprehensible human engineering.
Exactly. Now, I want you to imagine trying to tell that incredibly messy vid story using nothing but pure minimalist two-dimensional lines on a stark white background.
Which is the ultimate exercise in data storytelling through aggressive subtraction. I mean, it really is.
Yes, because we are deep diving into this fascinating 15-page presentation design brief today. And this brief was specifically mandated for an expert audience.
The instructions are incredibly strict, too.
Very strict. It demands a pure white background. Absolutely no flashy 3D graphics, no drop shadows, no distracting stock photos of skylines.
Right, just deep grays for the primary text and navy blue to emphasize the data.
And some subtle Morandi gray blues and gray greens to separate the charts. So it completely forces the viewer, and by extension you listening to this, to look at the raw, unvarnished geometry of a country's historical trajectory.
And the country we are mapping out today is the United Arab Emirates, or the UAE.
Which is just a fascinating case study.
Oh, absolutely. To understand their trajectory from the 1960s straight through to the 2020s, we have a staggering stack of macro data from the World Bank and the United Nations. We are talking dense CSV files covering economics, demographics, health education, the environment, and governance.
And our mission for this deep dive is to read between the lines of this minimalist design brief. We need to unpack the actual human mechanics hidden inside these charts.
Because we aren't just going to list off numbers. We want to explore the logistics of resource-driven growth, an unprecedented population explosion, and the incredibly precarious challenge of replacing your own economic engine while driving at top speed.
Right. And data can tell you what happened, but
Yes.
unless you interrogate the underlying mechanics, you will never understand how or why it happened.
Exactly. When you map out the multidimensional socioeconomic evolution of the UAE, you're essentially looking at a laboratory for rapid structural transition. We have to examine how these massive influxes of capital physically interact with human geography on the ground.
So let's unpack this, starting with the fundamental engine of it all, right? The sheer scale of the wealth.
The macro trends.
Yeah, because the third slide mandated by this design brief looks at the gross national income, the GNI, and the gross domestic product, the GDP. And the expansion we are looking at is frankly hard to wrap your head around.
It really is. The data shows the GNI per capita calculated using the Atlas method starting out around $5,160 in the early days.
Which is pretty modest.
Right, but then it rockets to peaks over $53,000. And if you look at the purchasing power parity, the PPP GDP per capita, it hits a staggering $80,000 to $100,000 range.
But hold on, before we get lost in the macroeconomic weeds here, what do those specific terms actually mean for a normal person? Like, what is the Atlas method, or PPP?
It is an important baseline to establish. When we look at wealth over a long period, we have to account for illusions in the data.
Illusions.
Yeah, so the Atlas method is a specific formula used by the World Bank to smooth out the noise of exchange rate fluctuations. If a country's currency suddenly spikes or crashes against the dollar, it might look like their economy doubled or halved overnight, when in reality, the actual production of goods didn't change at all.
Okay, that makes sense.
So the Atlas method uses a 3-year moving average to filter out that volatility. That way we are looking at real, tangible wealth growth.
So it basically prevents the data from lying to us based on a currency glitch.
Exactly. And purchasing power parity, or PPP, takes that a step further. It adjusts the wealth to reflect the actual cost of living.
Right, because $100,000 buys you a very different lifestyle in New York City than it does in a rural town.
Precisely. PPP standardizes the data so we can compare the true purchasing power of an individual in the UAE against a global baseline. And when you look at it through both of those rigorously filtered lenses, the velocity of wealth accumulation in the UAE is astonishing.
Astonishing is putting it mildly, I think. The brief calls for this to be visualized as a 2D double-line chart. And the designer is explicitly instructed to draw a stark red circle, just a thin outline, to highlight the steepest decade of this growth.
And they have to label it with a simple upward-pointing arrow marking the exponential expansion phase.
But when I look at the raw data underneath that red circle, I see a historical GDP growth rate hitting a 76% annual spike in the early years. Wait, let me push back on that because that breaks the laws of normal
But
economics.
it's definitely anomalous.
Right? If my small business grows 76% in 1 year, my supply chain breaks, my employees burn out, and the system collapses, how does an entire nation absorb a 76% cash injection without the physical infrastructure just melting down under the weight of it?
Well, you are hitting on the central logistical crisis of sudden resource monetization.
Okay.
When a nation discovers and begins aggressively exporting a highly demanded global commodity, in this case hydrocarbons, the inflow of capital vastly outpaces the physical capacity of the country to absorb it.
Because there's nowhere to put it.
Exactly. You have billions of dollars entering a system that in the 1960s had very few paved roads, limited port facilities, and a tiny administrative state. The friction there is immense.
So you essentially have a bank account the size of Jupiter, but you only have a single ATM to withdraw from, and it's located in a desert.
That is a very apt way to visualize the bottleneck.
Yeah. The early spikes in GDP aren't reflecting an organic expansion of localized businesses. They reflect the sudden massive integration of natural resources into the global market.
So the money just floods in.
Right, and the challenge isn't making the money. The challenge is deploying it. If you try to build 10 hospitals at once, but you don't have enough concrete, the price of concrete locally skyrockets. You get massive inflationary pressure.
So how do you fix that? The only way to bypass that bottleneck is to immediately start using the capital to import the very capacity you lack. Importing construction firms, importing materials, and crucially, importing labor.
Which brings up a massive contradiction in the very next visual on slide 4. Because the design brief mandates an area chart immediately following that explosive growth curve.
Right, the national wealth slide.
Yeah, but this area chart shows the per capita wealth, the wealth divided by the number of people basically flattening out. The curve stops rocketing upward and starts hovering and fluctuating around the $43,000 mark in recent years.
Which confuses a lot of people.
It does, because if the total wealth of the nation is still massive and they successfully diversified into logistics and tourism and aviation, why did the individual slice of the pie stop growing?
The math of per capita indicators relies entirely on the denominator, the population. The area chart flattening out isn't a sign of economic stagnation at all.
It's not.
No, it is a mathematical inevitability when you engineer a society to scale its physical infrastructure that rapidly. The horizontal dashed arrow the design brief asks for, pointing to this flattened curve, is labeled specifically to show the dilution of per capita indicators due to a population surge.
Okay, wait, let me try to visualize the mechanics of that. It is like you are baking a pie for a dinner party. You put this pie in the oven, and magically, because of resource extraction, it grows 10 times larger. It is the biggest, richest pie you have ever seen.
I like this analogy.
Right. But right as you pull it out of the oven to serve it, 100 brand new guests walk through your front door. The pie is undeniably massive now, but the size of the slices you hand out, those have to stabilize or even shrink a little simply because the number of people standing in your kitchen just exploded.
That perfectly illustrates the dilution effect. The macroeconomic indicators of total output are fighting against the sheer gravitational pull of an expanding population base.
So to build a diversified economy, you mentioned the deep water ports, the international airports, the financial centers. They had to import millions of workers.
Exactly. And every time a new worker arrives to help build the infrastructure, they are added to the denominator of that per capita equation.
So the wealth didn't stop growing. The denominator just caught up to it, which naturally forces us to ask, who exactly are all these new guests in the kitchen? Because you don't just organically birth a massive construction workforce out of thin air.
You do not. And this is where the narrative transitions from pure economics to human geography on slide 5.
The population explosion.
Right. If we look at the data driving the next set of visual mandates, the total population skyrockets from less than 100,000 people to nearly 10 million.
Going from a population the size of a small American suburb to a megacity-level nation, and doing it in just a few decades.
And the urbanization is extreme.
The data shows urban population growth rates hitting an unbelievable 19.2% at one point. I really want to pause and think about the physical reality of a 19.2% annual growth in a city.
It is hard to even picture.
It really is. That means every 5 years you have to effectively build an entirely new city right next to the one you just finished, just to house the new arrivals. Where do these people even sleep while the buildings are being built? How do you lay the sewer pipes fast enough?
The logistics are staggering, and it requires a centralized administrative capability that can completely bypass the usual decades-long zoning and planning debates you see in older cities. But the visual required on slide 6 to represent this population isn't a chart of city boundaries. It is a demographic structure.
The population pyramid.
Yes. In sociology, we use something called a population pyramid. Usually it looks exactly like the name implies. A wide base at the bottom representing a large number of children being born, tapering up steadily through the middle working ages as people naturally die off over time, and narrowing to a tiny point at the top for the elderly.
But the design brief explicitly forbids drawing a normal pyramid. It mandates a visual that highlights a severe structural anomaly. It looks more like a massive diamond or an inverted pyramid.
Right? It is unnaturally extremely wide right in the middle.
The data reveals that the 15 to 64 age bracket makes up a massive dominant share of the population. We were looking at data points where this working age demographic peaks heavily into the 80% range of the total population.
And the 0 to 14 age group drops significantly down to about 15%.
Which is crazy because you don't get 80% of your population in the working age bracket by having a lot of babies since babies start at age 0. The only way you achieve that geometric shape is through a massive, unprecedented influx of adult expatriate labor. You are importing fully grown humans.
If we look at the mechanics of this, we have to introduce the concept of the dependency ratio.
What's that?
The dependency ratio is an economic metric that compares the number of dependents, meaning children under 15 and retirees over 65, to the number of working-age people. In much of the developed world right now in Europe and East Asia, there is a looming economic crisis because the dependency ratio is rising.
Populations are aging.
Exactly. You have fewer and fewer active workers generating tax revenue to support more and more elderly citizens who require pensions and health care.
So those countries have an inverted pyramid, but it's as top-heavy with retirees. But the UAE data shows the exact opposite structural anomaly. Because they imported millions of working-age adults, their dependency ratio must be practically non-existent.
It is extremely low.
You have a society where almost everyone is in their prime economic producing years. You don't have to pay to put them through kindergarten, and you aren't paying for their end-of-life care. It is an artificially engineered demographic dividend.
It is a profound structural advantage for rapid economic acceleration. You are completely stripping away the generational lag time of raising a workforce.
Wow.
And the presentation brief asks the designer to use large brackets to highlight this massively wide middle section of the pyramid, labeling it as an extreme demographic dividend driven by labor migration.
Right, this imported adult workforce is the physical engine that actually laid the concrete, built the electrical grid, and constructed the ports funded by the wealth spikes we discussed earlier.
Precisely.
But I see your point about it being an economic advantage, but let me challenge that framing. You called it a demographic dividend, but isn't it also a massive logistical liability?
How so?
Well, if 80% of your population consists of temporary adult workers, what happens to social cohesion? What happens to the cultural fabric when the vast majority of people walking down the street aren't citizens, but temporary residents there to execute a job?
That is the precise friction point of this model, and it is something the data reflects quite starkly. The economic efficiency of importing labor comes with intense sociological complexity. It creates a bifurcated society.
A bifurcated society.
Yes, you have a citizen population with its own organic demographic trends deeply supported by the state, existing alongside a massive transient expatriate population that fluctuates based on macroeconomic project cycles.
That sounds incredibly complicated to govern.
It is. The state has to manage entirely different sets of infrastructure, legal frameworks, and social services for these parallel groups.
And when you look closely at that massive imported labor force, an even more jarring structural anomaly jumps out of the data on slide 7. And this one is defined by gender.
Right, the gender structure and labor participation.
Because if you are importing millions of people to build skyscrapers and lay highway infrastructure in the desert, you aren't importing a perfectly balanced demographic.
You are not, because the historical labor immigration was heavily weighted toward construction-heavy industry and certain manual service sectors. The overall population data became heavily skewed male.
Extremely skewed. The historical numbers show roughly 6.6 million males compared to roughly 2.8 million females.
That is a staggering ratio.
It is. If you just looked at that top-level number, more than double the number of men to women. You might assume you were looking at a society where women have practically no economic footprint.
Yeah.
You would picture a society entirely dominated by male participation.
But then the data throws a massive curveball.
It really does.
Yeah.
When you isolate the female population that is there and look at their labor force participation rates, there is a distinct, incredibly sharp upward trend.
Right. The modeled estimates show female labor force participation rising from the low 30% range to near 65% in various metrics.
This is where the presentation brief demands absolute clarity from the designer, because the visual has to capture two seemingly contradictory realities occurring simultaneously.
And for slide 11, dealing with education, it mandates a dumbbell plot.
It's a dumbbell plot.
Yeah, it is a specific minimalist chart used to show the change between two data points over time or to compare two groups. Imagine a horizontal line with a dot on each end like a dumbbell.
Okay, I can picture that.
Here it is used to show male and female youth literacy rates. The plot shows these 2 points, which were once separated, historically converging rapidly at near 100%.
And it also asks the designer to draw a circle highlighting the Gender Parity Index,
Yeah.
the GPI, right?
Yes. The GPI is a socioeconomic index usually designed to measure the relative access to education of males and females. A GPI of exactly 1.0 means there is perfect equality in educational access and enrollment.
And sometimes the data shows females even having an advantage in certain stages.
True. The design brief wants a stark circle around the data point where the UAE hits that 1.0 baseline in primary and secondary education.
And on the employment side, on slide 7, the brief highlights a bold upward arrow tracking female economic integration. So we have the fascinating paradox, a massive overall gender imbalance in the total population driven by the mechanics of imported physical labor existing right alongside a rapid, highly structured empowerment of women in education and the domestic workforce.
It speaks to how deliberate policy can operate within that bifurcated society we discussed. The overall population number is heavily skewed by the temporary male-dominated construction pools. But within the citizen population and within the long-term resident professional expatriate class, there has been a systematic, highly funded drive toward educational and economic parity. The state utilized its macro wealth to rapidly build universities, mandate integrated workplaces, and shift cultural paradigms at an accelerated pace.
I want to dig into the mechanics of that accelerated pace. Imagine building a society practically from scratch and achieving educational gender parity, almost overnight, historically speaking. Most nations take a century or more of grueling social advocacy to reach a 1.0 GPI.
That is very true.
So is this a case where having essentially unlimited capital actually fast-tracks social infrastructure faster than organic societal evolution would normally allow? Like if a government has enough money, can it simply buy equality of access by outbuilding the scarcity?
Wealth removes the friction of scarcity, which is often the primary historical barrier to parity. In early-stage developing economies, when a government or a family has limited capital, they are forced to make choices about who gets educated.
And historically, those choices favored males.
Exactly. But when a state does not have to choose between funding a boys' school or a girls' school, because the influx of hydrocarbon wealth means it can easily afford to build state-of-the-art facilities for both simultaneously, the physical and structural barriers to parity dissolve much faster.
So the money builds the buildings, but you still have to get people to walk through the door.
Exactly. The capital is the catalyst. But the data reflects a deliberate top-down policy choice to deploy that capital specifically toward human development.
Because they could have spent it on anything else.
Right. You can have all the wealth in the world and choose to spend it purely on military hardware or offshore investments. The rapid convergence on that dumbbell plot shows a focused administrative effort to utilize the female demographic as a core component of the diversified post-oil professional workforce.
Speaking of human development and fast-tracking infrastructure, the most profound impact of this wealth isn't just happening in the classroom. It is happening at the most fundamental baseline of human existence survival.
The health data.
Yeah, let's look at slides 8, 9, and 10, because these CSV files contain some of the most dramatic developmental leaps you will ever see in demographic history.
The magnitude of the shift is staggering. Over a span of just a few decades, life expectancy in the UAE jumps from around 50 years in the 1960s to approximately 80 years today.
From 50 to 80, I want you to really internalize what that means. That is an entire extra 30 years of life. That means generations who would have died before their children reached adulthood are now living to see their great-grandchildren. It fundamentally alters the psychological and familial structure of a society.
And the infant mortality data is even more extreme.
It is. The numbers plummet from over 111 deaths per 1,000 live births down to single digits around 4 or 5 per 1,000. And maternal mortality experiences what the design brief calls a cliff-edge drop falling to near zero, hovering around 3 deaths per 100,000 live births.
To visualize this, the design brief mandates a smooth upward line tracking life expectancy. No 3D shadows, no grid lines, just a clean line with solid dots at 50 and 80.
Very minimalist.
Yes, the extreme simplicity of the design is meant to force the viewer to confront the sheer scale of the achievement without distraction. And for infant mortality, it requires a sharp, downward-pointing arrow cutting through a line graph.
Ending in a circle around those single-digit mortality rates, right?
Right. Explicitly noting this as the direct, undeniable result of universalized medical access.
But let's look at the mechanics of actually pulling that off.
Yeah.
How do you build a universal healthcare system that reduces infant mortality by that much at the exact same time your population is growing at 19% a year?
It seems impossible.
The logistics of that do seem impossible. Every time you build a clinic, 100,000 new people arrive in the country. How do you scale the medical staff? You can't train a doctor in a year.
You manage it through the exact same mechanism used to build the physical infrastructure, aggressive, capital-intensive importation of capacity.
Just buy from outside.
Basically, yes. The state didn't wait to organically train a massive domestic medical workforce because that takes decades. Instead, they built the physical hospitals and simultaneously recruited entire armies of doctors, nurses, and specialists from South Asia, Europe, and the broader Middle East.
So they essentially bought pre-trained human capital from the global market and plugged it into state-of-the-art, newly constructed medical facilities.
It is a plug-and-play healthcare system scaled to a national level.
Wow.
Precisely. And the data shows it was incredibly effective at solving the historical threats to human life. But this rapid success leads to a fascinating structural paradox, which is mapped out in the next visual requirement on slide 10.
Oh, the epidemiological shift.
Right. The designer is instructed to create a minimalist tree map, or a 2D donut chart. And this chart maps out the changing causes of death.
And this is where the story takes a very complex turn.
We call it the structural reversal of mortality. Historically, if you look at the mid-20th century, communicable diseases, infectious diseases, viruses, cholera, things that spread rapidly through a population, especially in harsh conditions, they were the main threat to life.
But the donut chart we are meant to visualize shows a complete historical inversion. Today, communicable diseases account for a tiny fraction of mortality in the UAE, less than 7%.
And the massive dominant block of that donut chart.
The thing that is actually killing people now, it takes up almost 69% of the visual space.
Those are non-communicable diseases, or NCDs.
Right.
This category refers to cardiovascular disease, diabetes, chronic respiratory diseases, and various forms of cancer.
This is the ultimate paradox of rapid modern prosperity. It is as if they fast-forwarded through 200 years of medical and sociological history in just a few decades.
They really did.
They poured massive amounts of capital into hospitals, sanitation, clean water, and vaccines, and they completely solved the historical problem of surviving childhood. They eradicated the traditional threats, only to immediately unlock the final boss, the diseases of a highly urbanized, sedentary, high-income lifestyle.
That is a great way to frame it. If you look at how this transition happened in Europe, it took over a century. The gradual industrial revolution slowly changed diets and work habits, and the medical field evolved alongside those changes.
But here, it was immediate.
Right in the UAE, this shift happened in less than a single lifetime. You have genetics that adapted over millennia to survive extreme heat scarcity, and a nomadic or pearl diving lifestyle suddenly placed into a fully engineered, hyperabundant indoor environment.
Because when you build a society centered around extreme desert heat, where massive air conditioning is practically mandatory for survival 6 months out of the year, and where urban design heavily favors the automobile over walking, the physical demands on the human body completely change.
You just aren't moving the same way. Exactly. Add in the fact that high incomes naturally lead to globalized shifts in dietary patterns, more processed foods, more calorie-dense meals, and the disease burden fundamentally shifts.
You no longer die from unsafe water. You die from the systemic long-term effects of metabolic syndrome.
Wow.
And the healthcare system succeeded so rapidly and so efficiently in keeping people alive through infancy and trauma that it now has to pivot its entire multi-billion-dollar infrastructure toward managing chronic lifestyle-induced conditions over a 40-year period.
Which is a completely different logistical challenge. I mean, you can vaccinate against a virus. You cannot vaccinate against a sedentary lifestyle.
You absolutely cannot.
And maintaining that heavily engineered indoor lifestyle, running all those air conditioners, powering the massive desalination plants required to get fresh drinking water from the ocean, fueling the cars for a population that exploded to 10 million, well, that requires a massive, almost incomprehensible amount of electricity.
Which brings us to slides 12 and 13, the energy structure and the environmental cost of this miracle in the desert. Right here, we confront the physical limits and the ecological friction of the economic engine we've been tracking. For decades, the data shows that the UAE's electricity production was 100% reliant on fossil fuels.
Every single megawatt keeping those air conditioners running and those hospitals powered was generated by burning oil or natural gas.
And visually, the design brief handles this brilliantly on slide 12. It asks for a step-line chart. I want you to imagine a perfectly flat line sitting at the absolute ceiling of the chart at 100%, running straight across the decades unmoving. But then right at the very end of the timeline, it takes a historic, unmistakable downward step.
The reliance on fossil fuels for electricity generation dropped to around 91.7%.
Now, to a casual observer, 91.7% fossil fuel reliance still sounds overwhelmingly high.
It does sound high. But macroeconomically, breaking that 100% floor for the first time in the nation's history is a massive inflection point. It represents the actual physical integration of utility-scale alternative energy into the national grid.
So we're talking about the activation of massive solar arrays and the introduction of nuclear energy.
Yes, it is a historical breakthrough for clean energy replacement.
But right next to that downward step on slide 13, the brief demands a counterweight. It asks for a stacked area chart showing total carbon dioxide emissions with a stark red warning circle drawn around recent peaks.
Because the environmental pressure is intense.
Right, because while the percentage of fossil fuels used in the grid is slightly dropping, the absolute total of carbon emissions in the energy and industrial sectors has soared. They climbed from negligible amounts in the past to tens of millions of metric tons. Like the electricity sector alone jumped to over 21 megatons.
So the grid is getting slightly cleaner on a percentage basis, but because the economy and the population are still growing so fast, the total pollution is still going up.
The friction involved in this energy transition is immense, and it presents an existential economic challenge. This is a nation whose sovereign wealth, the very capital used to fund the hospitals, build the universities, and import the labor you just discussed, is fundamentally derived from extracting and exporting hydrocarbons to the world.
And yet their domestic energy needs are so vast, and the global pressure to decarbonize is becoming so intense that they are forced to radically pivot their internal infrastructure.
I see people use the analogy of turning a supertanker around, but that feels way too passive for what's actually happening here.
I agree.
They aren't just slowly turning a ship, they're trying to rip the combustion engine out of a race car and replace it with an electric battery, all while the car is currently driving at 200 miles an hour down the track, and the entire pit crew is being paid using the gasoline they're trying to replace.
That is a much more accurate depiction of the volatility involved. The drop to 91.7% is the proof of concept that the engine can be swapped. Projects like the Baraka nuclear power plant and massive solar parks are not just prestige greenwashing projects, they are absolute mathematical necessities.
They have to do it.
They do. The state must decouple its domestic energy consumption from its export revenue. If they burn their own oil to power their own air conditioners, they can't sell it.
Right.
And more importantly, they have to address the ecological deficit highlighted by that red warning circle before global carbon tariffs or shifting energy markets completely devalue their primary asset.
Navigating a transition that precarious, redesigning your entire energy grid, managing a massive imported population, maintaining economic growth while per capita metrics stabilize and fighting off a wave of lifestyle diseases, well, you cannot just let the free market figure that out.
No, you really can't.
That requires incredibly strong, centralized administrative hands on the steering wheel.
Which brings us to slide 14, the governance data. To measure that administrative capacity, we look at a data set maintained by the World Bank called the Worldwide Governance Indicators, or WGI.
And what does that measure exactly?
These indicators measure complex structural concepts like government effectiveness, regulatory quality, and the rule of law. And the data for the UAE is striking. It consistently ranks extremely high, often above the 80th percentile globally, and specifically excels in the government effectiveness metric.
The design brief visualizes this with horizontal bar charts. The bars stretch all the way across the white background, hitting the top percentile axis on the far right, and they are finished off with a high visibility marker to denote administrative efficiency.
Which proves its high administrative capability in the Arab world and globally.
But let's break down what government effectiveness actually means on the ground. It doesn't just mean passing laws, right?
No government effectiveness in the WGI measures the quality of public services, the quality of the civil service, and the degree of its independence from political pressures, the quality of policy formulation and implementation, and the credibility of the government's commitment to such policies.
Simply put, it measures state capacity.
Exactly. Can the government actually execute its plans when they say they are going to build a nuclear power plant? Does it get built? Does it operate safely? And does it integrate into the grid?
Right, because if you have all the oil wealth in the world, but your government effectiveness is at the 20th percentile, you don't get a thriving global hub. You get a failed state where the money vanishes into corruption and the infrastructure rots.
Looking at this strictly through the lens of the data, the success of this nation, its rapid transformation from a localized traditional economy to a high-income global logistics and financial hub, is mathematically built on a very specific interlocking three-pillar model.
Okay, what are the three pillars?
Pillar 1, resource extraction to provide uncapped capital. Pillar 2, massive labor importation to bypass domestic demographic constraints and actually build the vision. And Pillar 3, highly effective centralized administrative governance to manage the extreme complexity of the first two pillars and prevent institutional collapse.
If any one of those three pillars fails, the entire race car crashes. If the governance is weak, the resource wealth is squandered. If the labor isn't imported, the infrastructure simply never gets built because there aren't enough hands to pour the concrete. It is a finely tuned, engineered machine.
It is. And that leads us to the final slide of the presentation. Slide 15.
The research conclusions and strategic outlook.
Yes. The design brief asks for a 3-column infographic, past, present, future. Pure text, simplified geometric icons, absolute academic rigor. We've used the data to explain the past and the present, but based on the mechanics we've discussed, what does the data tell us about the structural stress tests of the future?
Well, if we look closely at the mechanics, the data points to several looming, deeply interconnected challenges. First, we have to look back at that inverted demographic pyramid. The 15 to 64 imported labor bubble will eventually age.
That is a huge factor. How does the state manage the cyclical turnover of millions of expatriate workers in a highly competitive global market? Or do they begin integrating them into a permanent aging population, which would fundamentally alter that ultra-efficient dependency ratio we discussed?
Right. The demographic dividend is not permanent.
It is not. And second, there is the massive friction of the energy pivot. Maintaining that high level of government effectiveness while deeply diversifying the economy away from the very hydrocarbon resources that funded the rise of the state in the first place.
They have to fund the transition out of oil using the profits from oil before the world stops buying oil. The window to execute that maneuver is mathematically finite.
The ultimate challenge mapped out on that final slide is the transition from an economy of accumulation, gathering wealth, gathering people, rapidly building the physical shell of the state, to an economy of sustainable equilibrium.
Which is an entirely different game.
It is. Scaling up is difficult, but maintaining a massive, complex system at the top of the curve requires an entirely different set of administrative tools.
It is a profound human story told entirely through 2D lines, gray-blue bar charts, and stark white backgrounds. So to you listening to this, let's take a step back and look at the conceptual journey we just took through this data.
It has been quite a journey.
We traced the exponential spikes of raw national wealth, and we saw the mechanics of how millions of new arrivals mathematically diluted that wealth on a per capita basis. We interrogated the unnatural, engineered, inverted pyramid of a working-age population and debated the friction of importing a society.
We tracked the miraculous cliff-edge drop in mortality rates only to see the complex rise of modern urbanized lifestyle diseases.
And we witnessed the incredibly precarious, high-speed maneuver of stepping down from a 100% reliance on fossil fuels.
While this specific data applies to the United Arab Emirates, the underlying mechanics serve as a masterclass for anyone trying to understand macroeconomics, infrastructure scaling, and state capacity.
It proves that behind every dry CSV file, behind every meticulously designed, minimalist academic infographic, there is a vivid, incredibly complex reality of human engineering, deliberate policy choices, and rapid societal evolution.
The numbers are never just numbers, they are the physical limits of what humans can build.
Exactly. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought. A question that builds on the mechanics of all this data, but points toward a horizon we haven't fully reached yet.
What's the question?
Well, this entire economic engine, this unprecedented miracle in the desert, currently relies heavily on a massive imported working-age population. It relies on a global surplus of human capital, willing to move across borders for work. But as global demographics shift, as birth rates decline precipitously worldwide, and as AI and advanced robotics begin to fundamentally automate and replace physical labor, what happens to this imported pyramid model?
That is the big unknown.
Will the intensifying global competition for shrinking human capital combined with massive technological disruption force a complete redesign of this economic engine over the next 50 years? Something for you to ponder.